All right, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cameron Smith. I'm a Senior Workplace Program Associate here at Tanenbaum. And we're all here today, as you can see on the screen, for the fourth installment of this year's Religious Diversity Leadership Summit. Today's session will focus on demographic data, demographic data and trends on religious diversity. And just as we've done at the beginning of our previous summit sessions, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This is an intentional naming of the spaces in which we live and work, and it's part of a broader effort to decolonize our gathering spaces. If you're tuning in from New York City, where Tanenbaum's office is located, and across the water from where I am in Jersey City, we find ourselves connecting on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape Nation. We acknowledge that, like so many, we benefit from resources obtained both from ceded and unceded lands and from the settler colonial system. We'll put a link in the chat so that you can identify the indigenous land from which you're joining today, noting that this dynamic is certainly not limited to just the United States. And of course, please feel free to share where you're joining us from, making sure that your chat is set to share to both panelists and attendees. As we've done in previous weeks, we want to acknowledge this week's upcoming holidays. So the Buddhist holiday Vesak Day will take place tomorrow, May 26th. And this Friday, May 28th, marks the ascension of Baha'u'llah for those of the Baha'i faith. We'd also like to recognize our generous sponsors, without whom the summit wouldn't be possible. The Walt Disney Company is not only a longstanding corporate leader, but also a longstanding sponsor of this event. We're grateful for their continued support and for their ongoing partnership in addressing religious diversity and inclusion. We'd also like to thank another Tanenbaum corporate member, MITRE. The MITRE Corporation is an American not-for-profit organization that manages federally funded research and development centers supporting several US government agencies. Like so many of you tuning in today, MITRE is committed to diversity and fuller inclusion and is fundamentally committed to the achievement of excellence and inclusion for all employees across the globe. We're grateful to MITRE for both their commitment to D&I and for their generous support of the summit. And finally, I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers. Samirah Majumdar is a research associate at Pew Research Center, where she focuses on global restrictions on religion. Conrad Hackett, meanwhile, is also of Pew Research Center, excuse me. He serves as Associate Director of Research and Senior Demographer. His expertise is in international religious demography, sociology of religion, and how religions relate to characteristics including gender, fertility, and education. Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan fact tank that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. They conduct public opinion polling, demographic research, content analysis, and other data-driven social science research. Notably, they do not take policy positions. If you've attended previous iterations of the summit, you're likely already familiar with some of the specifics of Pew's work, and you'll understand then why we're so excited to have him back this year. And with that, I will turn things over to Conrad.
Thanks very much, Cameron, and thanks to everybody for tuning in today. It's a pleasure for Samirah and I to join you. So I lead a team at Pew Research Center that studies the size and characteristics of religious groups around the world. And this morning, I wanted to share with you some of the highlights from work we've done over the last decade. The first few years of our team's work were about measuring the size and characteristics of religions around the world using the best available census or survey data for each country in the world. And this slide is a word about the Pew Research Center. Cameron went over the content of this. It tells you about who we are at Pew Research Center. So the picture that emerges of the world's religious landscape looks like this. These are the 8 religious groups that we enumerate, and this shows the count and the share of each religious group in the world population. Christians are the largest group in the world with about nearly a third of the world's population. Muslims number nearly 2 billion people. The unaffiliated population, which includes atheists, agnostics, and people who identify with no religion in particular, numbers over 1 billion. And the final group with more than 1 billion adherents is the world's Hindu population. There are about 500 million Buddhists in the world and nearly 400 million people in a category we call folk religion, which includes Aboriginal religion, Native American religion, Chinese folk religion. There's a catch-all category next of other religions, which includes everything from Scientology to Shintoism. And the least populous group that we enumerate is the world's Jewish population. On this map, you see colored in red countries where Christians are the largest religious group in a country. Green are countries where Muslims are the largest group. And in China, you see a kind of a gray color, which indicates that the religiously unaffiliated are the largest group in that country. One thing that's interesting about this map is that about 2 out of 3 of the world's countries and territories are shaded in red, indicating Christians are the largest group, even though, as we saw in the last slide, Christians only make up about 1/3 of the world's population. They're just very evenly distributed around the world and make up a large share of many countries. On this next slide, we see the second largest group in each country shaded. And here, in those countries that previously were red, indicating Christians were the largest group, it tends to be the pattern that the unaffiliated are the second largest group. And in countries where Muslims were the largest group with a green shade, now it is often the case that Christians are the second largest group in that country. Another way of thinking about the geography of religious identification is to think about how a group is regionally concentrated. Oftentimes, when people think about the world's Muslim population, they think of the Middle East, North Africa, which does have the highest share of its internal population identifying with Islam. But the number of Muslims around the world in the Asia-Pacific region is actually 3 times greater than the share in the Middle East, North Africa region. And in terms of other preconceptions about the distribution of religious groups, many of us in the United States probably think about the headlines we see about the rise of people of no religion in the United States, in Europe, maybe in Australia or New Zealand. But it turns out that the largest number of people that we count as being in the no religion category is in China, and the second largest population is in Japan. And fully 3 out of 4 people who identify with no religion are in some nation in Asia Pacific. The United States has the 3rd largest population of people in the unaffiliated category. Yet another way to think about the geography of religion is to think about the diversity of religions within a country. It's often remarked upon that the United States has a very high level of religious diversity. And it's true that there are both a lot of flavors of Christianity, including hundreds of categories of Baptists alone, and many of the world's religions present in relatively modest shares. But because Christians are the largest group overall, the United States doesn't rank as highly as nations of East Asia when it comes to having an even distribution of the 8 religious groups that we enumerate in our work. It turns out that Singapore is actually the country with the highest level of religious diversity by the index that we used with our 8 religious categories. It would be different if we counted the country with the most variety of Baptists present. Okay, in the next slides, I'm going to turn to thinking about religious commitment and looking particularly at measures of religious salience, how important religion is in a person's life, how frequently they pray, how often they go to religious services, and how these measures vary by a country's wealth, as well as by the gender and the age of individuals. In this slide, we see how countries vary in the share of the population that says religion is very important in their lives. In Ethiopia, 98% of people say religion is very important, while in China, only 3% say that. The countries generally in the global south, shaded in orange, have high levels of religiosity. And in Europe, especially in Russia, China, Japan, few people say that religion is very important in their lives. The United States is kind of in the middle with about 53% saying religion is very important. A general pattern is that in wealthy countries, it's often the case that on any given measure, we see a smaller share of people saying religion is central to their lives. This particular slide looks at the share of adults who say they pray daily on a scatter plot against per capita gross domestic product. And one of the interesting patterns that's called out here in this slide is that the United States is the only country with above average GDP per capita and above average frequency of daily prayer. So the United States stands out among wealthy countries for having a relatively high level of religiosity. In the next set of slides, we look at gender differences in religion. A few years ago, it was very common for scholars of religion to make the claim that women are universally more religious than men. And so we investigated this claim with our data from many countries around the world. In this first slide, we see in orange the countries where women are more likely than men to say they have some kind of religious affiliation. And here the pattern is clear. There were no countries where men were more likely by at least 2 percentage points to say they had an affiliation. Although there are many countries where basically everybody has an affiliation, so there wasn't much difference between men and women. In this slide, the countries in blue are countries where men are more likely than women to say they attended religious services at least once a week. And these countries are generally Muslim majority countries and Israel, where there's an expectation that men should be present for Friday prayers, for worship in the synagogue, and less of an expectation that women would be present in those public worship settings. In orange, those are the countries where women are more likely than men to be present for weekly services. And these countries, shaded in orange, tend to be Christian majority countries. There's a lot going on in this next slide. One column, we see values for Christians, and the second column is values for Muslims. And the top row is the attendance measure that we were looking at in the last slide for overall populations. The pattern is similar, where in orange, these are countries where Christian women are more likely than Christian men to attend services weekly. And in the next slide, in the upper corner, you see colored in blue that anywhere there's a difference between men and women among Muslims, Muslims are more likely to attend weekly. But in the second and third row, the measures are respondents saying they pray daily or saying that religion is very important in their lives. And on these two measures, again, we see that among Christians, it's often the case that women are more religious than men. However, among Muslims, there tend not to be a difference between women and men. And so this leads to a key takeaway from our study, which is that while it is often the case that among Christians, women are more religious on a variety of measures than men, that isn't necessarily the case across measures for Muslims or other religious groups that we studied. This next slide has a little different interpretation of what the colors mean. In this case, the color orange indicates less religiosity among people under 40, and blue indicates less religiosity among older respondents. So the question is basically who's less religious, older adults or younger adults? And as you might expect, it is the case in many countries around the world that younger people are significantly less religious across a variety of measures, all those we've talked about, compared to older adults. Now I want to turn to talking briefly about some of the demographic characteristics of religious groups. There's quite a difference in the median age of religious groups. If you lined up the youngest Muslim in the world to the oldest Muslim in the world, the person in the middle would be about 24, whereas the median Jew would be about 37. And the other religious groups have median ages somewhere in between this range. There's also a big difference in terms of how many children women are having in each tradition. Muslim women have the most children, with nearly 3 children per woman. Hindus and Christians and Jews each have above replacement level fertility, replacement level being about 2.1 children per woman. And then the other religious groups have lower than replacement level fertility, indicating that without some kind of other change, such as through religious switching, over the long term, these groups would be expected to decline in number. As you might expect, there's significant variation in terms of where higher fertility is found among a given religious group. So among Christians, for example, fertility is much higher in Africa. and that has demographic consequences we'll see in a few slides. When it comes to religious switching, which we've measured in surveys that ask about childhood religion and current religion, we have found that the biggest pattern overall is people saying they grew up Christian and they no longer identify with any religion. Although in our studies, we've measured switching between all other religious groups, there's just not as much net activity in other directions of switching. We've measured educational differences around the world. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you see the global averages for educational attainment. Jews and Christians globally have the most years of education attained, and Muslims and Hindus have the fewest years on average. However, in the United States, the pattern is quite different. It turns out that in the US, Christians have the lowest number of years of education on average, and every other group has a greater number. Part of the story there is about selective migration. So Hindus outside India tend to have very high levels of educational attainment, even though in India, Hindu educational attainment isn't particularly high compared to attainment of other groups around the world. In this GIF, there's some information about sub-Saharan Africa, where we found a striking pattern. 4 out of every 10 adults have no formal education. And there's a huge difference between Christians and Muslims. It's the largest gap of any region in the world, where Muslims have much higher levels of not having any formal education than Christians. And this is actually widening over time. Now, finally, I want to share with you our global population projections. We project that because of the demographic differences in fertility and age structure, that Muslims are going to increase as a share of the world's population 70% growth from where they are now to where they will be in 2060, compared to 32% growth in the overall size of the world's population. Christians should basically keep pace with global population change, and then other religious groups may grow, but not at the same pace as the world's population. Because of high fertility in Africa, especially, we expect that over the next century, Christians and Muslims are both likely to grow as a share of the world's population. But after about 2070, we expect that Muslims may begin to exceed Christians as a share of the world's population. Meanwhile, there will be a significant shift in the distribution of the world's populations of religious groups. Looking backwards, this cartogram shows the relative size of the world's Christian population 100 years ago, when about 60% of the world's Christian population was in Europe, compared to 2010, when Christians make up European Christians make up a much smaller share of the global picture. And there's been tremendous growth in the number of Christians in Africa and in Asia and Latin America. Similarly, we expect that by 2060, there will continue to be significant growth in the share of the world's Christians in the sub-Saharan Africa region. And this GIF shows in animated fashion how that shift is expected to take place. All of our reports are on our website, and I look forward later on in the session to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
All right. I know that was a lot of information on demographic data. I'll be switching gears slightly now, and I'll talk about our study on religious restrictions around the world. I'll explain how we measure restrictions on religion and then get into some of the latest findings. So at Pew Research Center, we've been measuring the ways in which governments and societies restrict religion around the world for over a decade now. Government restrictions on religion involve laws, policies, and actions by state authorities that limit the free practice of religion, and social hostilities involving religion are actions and incidents like religion-related harassment and violence carried out by private individuals or groups. So we've been doing the study on an annual basis, and we've produced reports that cover data from 2007 to 2018. And the study covers 198 countries, and we produced 2 indexes with it. Now, this slide has a lot of information on it. Basically, we have 2 indexes in our study. One is the Government Restrictions Index that measures the ways that national and local governments restrict religion, including through force and coercion. So in this index, we've got 20 indicators, and some of the questions that we look at include whether country constitutions provide for religious freedom, whether all religious groups receive the same level of government access and privileges, whether the wearing of religious symbols such as head coverings for women or facial hair for men are regulated by law, and whether there was any government harassment or intimidation of religious groups by any level of government. And then on the right side, you'll see we have the Social Hostilities Index, and this measures the ways in which private individuals and social groups infringe on religious beliefs and practices. Here we have 13 indicators, and some of the questions include whether there's been any social harassment of religious groups, whether women were harassed for violating religious dress codes, whether there was mob violence related to religion, or if there were religion-related terrorist group activity in the country. On both of these indexes, the scores range from 0 to 10, and each country is assigned a score on both index. The sources that we gathered information from for this study include country constitutions, reports from the US State Department, several reports from independent non-governmental organizations, United Nations bodies, and databases from universities. We combed through a set of about 20 primary sources that are listed on this page, and we answer the same series of questions that I just mentioned earlier for each country that we look at. We record only factual information from the sources on specific policies or actions in each country, and we sort them into the 2 buckets of government restrictions and social hostilities that you saw in the earlier slide. So that's just a brief look at how we conduct the study. Now let's look at some of the findings from our latest report. So the latest report was published in 2020, but it covers data up to 2018. That's the latest year that we have data for. So in 2018, government restrictions on religion, which, as I said earlier, are the laws, policies, and actions by government that limit religious beliefs and practices, they were at the highest level since 2007, when we began tracking this issue. The increase since the previous year was relatively modest, but when you look at the larger picture in this chart, you see that government restrictions have grown substantially from 2007. After some fluctuation in the early years, the median score has risen steadily since 2011. So the number of countries that had high or very high levels of government restrictions has been mounting as well. In 2018, this number reached a 5-year high and was close to the peak in 2012. When we look more broadly among the regions that we studied, overall, we see that the Middle East and North Africa region has always had the highest levels of government restrictions. But when we dug a little deeper, we saw in 2018 that the Asia Pacific region had the largest increase in government restrictions. And this was partly driven by more instances of governments using force, such as detentions or physical abuse against religious groups. Now, turning to social hostilities involving religion, which again are hostilities carried out by private individuals or groups, not governments. These types of hostilities can include derogatory comments targeted at religious groups. It can include harassment over religious attire, or religion-related mob violence, terrorism, or conflict. So if you look at the chart on the right, social hostilities, you can see, fell slightly in 2018, but it remained near the 2017 peak. The score has doubled in the past decade, but it has seen more year-to-year fluctuations compared to government restrictions. And if you take a look at the bar chart on the left, globally, the number of countries with high or very high levels of social hostilities has decreased slightly since the previous year. Now, when we look again at social hostilities broadly involving religion among regions that we look at, most regions experienced a decline in 2018 in social hostilities from the previous year, and only the Americas experienced an increase. Here again, you can see that the regions have seen more fluctuations in social hostilities over the years. And again, the Middle East and North Africa region has had the highest levels of social hostilities, although there have been declines in recent years. So those were some broad trends we've seen in overall government restrictions on social hostilities. When we take a closer look at our measures, one of the areas we see a growing trend in is the number of countries where women experience government restrictions and social hostilities involving their attire. Rules on attire are one of the many ways governments and societies impose restrictions on religion. As you can see here on this slide, the chart on the left shows government restrictions on attire, and these can range from prohibitions on wearing religious symbols or clothing in photographs for official documents or in public service jobs, and regulations that can spill over as national bans on religious dress in public places. In our most recent analysis, we saw that more than 60 countries had government restrictions on dress in 2018, and these were specifically regulations on head coverings. Separately, if you look at the line chart on the right, we see women in about 56 countries experience social harassment from private individuals or groups for clothing that was deemed to violate both religious or secular dress norms. And when we say social harassment, this can also range from verbal abuse to physical violence and is motivated, at least in part, by the target's religious identity. Now let's take a look at where women's dress is regulated by governments. These include both rules that prohibit religious garb and rules that require it. So as you can see on the map, every region has at least some rules about women's headdress. Europe had the most countries where women's head coverings were restricted by the government, with instances in 21 out of the region's 45 countries. To give a couple of examples, in Norway, the government passed a ban on face covering clothing at educational institutions, and the country continued to ban religious headwear and other religious symbols from being worn with police uniforms. But the country did allow religious headwear in the military. This shows that countries can vary in where they decide to implement their regulations on headwear. In 2018, Denmark also implemented a ban on face coverings that went into effect, and it included Islamic burqas and niqabs. From looking at our decade of data, we also see that in sub-Saharan Africa, the government has increasingly regulated wearing religious clothing. In 2015, we saw 4 countries ban Islamic veils for women in response to terror attacks within their borders. And those countries were Cameroon, Chad, the Republic of Congo, and Niger. But when we dig deeper than the regional trends, we see that government restrictions on head coverings can also vary by country. To give a few more examples, in Kosovo, public schools were reported to have enforced rules that are set by their Ministry of Education that prohibits wearing religious garb on school property. And there were cases where schools sent home students who insisted on wearing headscarves in class. By contrast, there were reports in Turkey from students and parents claiming that a school principal threatened that female students would receive failing grades if they did not wear head coverings. So we see both types of restrictions enforcing wearing headscarves and those that discourage it. In some countries, governments have specific rules for the type of religious clothing women should wear in general in public. In Iran, for example, the government requires all women to adhere to Islamic dress standards in public, including covering their hair and bodies in loose clothing. So these were examples of government regulations involving religious dress. Now looking at social harassment women faced for wearing dress that was considered either too religious or not religious enough, we see some variations by region as well. In the 5 regions that we cover, we saw again that Europe had the most countries where women face social harassment for clothing that was deemed not secular enough. And as you can see on the bar chart at the top, 20 countries in Europe had such incidents. And in all of these cases, Muslim women faced discrimination or physical violence. To give a couple examples, there was a case in Germany where a man hit a woman wearing a headscarf at a bus stop in Berlin after he had asked her about the headscarf, and she told him she was Muslim and that she'd like to wear it. And in another country example, in Hungary, there were multiple reports of individuals verbally insulting women and girls wearing headscarves on on the streets or in schools. The Asia Pacific region had the 2nd most countries with incidents of women facing harassment for violating dress codes. In Malaysia, for instance, police arrested a man who admitted to assaulting a woman because she was not wearing a headscarf. There are also multiple examples of harassment over dress in workplaces. In Kenya, in parts of the country, a teachers' union reported that female teachers were required to wear hijabs, while in Liberia, Muslim women reported experiencing workplace discrimination for wearing headscarves. So again, we see both sides of this type of restriction. So in 4 of the 5 regions covered in the study, social harassment for overly religious clothing was more common than harassment for overly secular clothing. The only exception was in the Middle East and North Africa, where women were more commonly harassed for clothing considered too secular. So for example, in Iraq, there were reports of non-Muslim minorities feeling pressured to wear the hijab, and some women and girls faced threats for wearing Western clothing or for refusing to wear the hijab. And separately, there were reports in Qatar of a Muslim woman being criticized for appearing on a news program without a hijab. So those were a lot of examples of the types of restrictions we see on attire. When we look at restrictions on attire as a whole, we see that on the government side of things, a growing number of countries have been regulating women's religious clothing. This can take the form of bans that are implemented throughout the whole country. And it can also involve laws and policies requiring head coverings at the local level as well. And when we look at social hostilities, we've seen increases in women being harassed for clothing that either doesn't adhere enough to religious norms or doesn't adhere enough to secular norms. So we see women being targeted for wearing veils in countries with more secular norms. And then in other places, we see women being harassed for not wearing veils and not adhering to religious dress customs in their societies. So these are some of the ways that government and restrictions on religion and social hostilities involving religion manifest in countries and regions. And the broad trend shows that government restrictions have been on the rise for over a decade, and social hostilities have seen more fluctuations in general. And with that, I'm actually going to stop here and turn it back to the moderators in a moment. Everything I've talked about is available on our website at pewresearch.org.
All right, thank you so much, Samirah and Conrad. As always, this has been incredibly insightful. You've given us so much to think about and so much to work with. With that in mind, we do have a few questions that have been submitted. And again, if you haven't submitted a question and you'd like to, please do so. We'll keep an eye on this. But jumping in with the first question that we got, I'll read it out verbatim. It says, the data showing that Muslim women do not seem to be more religious than Muslim men, examples include daily prayer, weekly prayer, importance of religion in life, is quite surprising. Do you think it is related to the survey questions asked and how women interpreted those questions? For example, much of what they do is informal prayer and acts of faith, which in the US we would count as religious or religion. but respondents may not because these acts are not formally connected to the mosque or some other sort of similar situation?
That's a great question. And yes, it's very likely that there's a lot that our survey questions don't capture. But an interesting case where we dealt with this in more detail was actually in Israel, because we did a special survey extensively measuring various religious practices and attitudes in Israel. And in that country, among non-secular Jews, on every measure we asked about, where there was a difference between men and women, men were more religious than women. And this was really surprising, including to a lot of experts in Israel that we consulted with. And they pointed out that there are practices like lighting candles and preparing meals that are part of Jewish rituals, that if we had asked about those things, then on those particular measures, as the questioner suggested, we might have found women showing more observance than men. And yet it's striking that when it comes to the measures we showed for Muslims and the analysis we did for Jews in Israel, we didn't find the expected clear pattern of women being more religious on those measures, as the literature had kind of set us up to expect.
Okay, thank you. And another question, it says, why are, excuse me, why are the regions so geographically broad? Is it possible to drill down more to specific regions?
Yes, absolutely. And the Asia Pacific region in particular is home to about 60% of the world's people. And in one of our early reports on the distribution of the world's Muslim population, we did do a lot of sub-regional analysis. Our reports tend to be very long, and we think about various topics, from the perspective of the religion, from the perspective of the region, sometimes country analysis, and it's really just a matter of bandwidth. In some cases, we do particular regional studies. So for example, after our projections report came out, there was a big movement in 2015 of refugee seekers going to Europe. And so we did a special update on the future of the Muslim population in Europe and went into more detail there. If anybody has any questions about particular countries or suggestions for studies they'd like to see us do, we'd be happy to consider that. But it's just a matter of a 200-page report already being very long.
I can add a little bit onto that. For our study on restrictions on religion, we do this broader regional analysis, but we also do country analysis as well. And this is all listed in the backs of our reports. We have lengthy appendices that list out the breakdown of scores for countries. Another reason that we continue to look at these broad regions for the restrictions study is that it is an annual report, and we have over a decade of data. And at Pew, we really like to look at trends. So we like to measure things consistently, and we like to do our analysis consistently. So looking at these regions over the years consistently is important for those trend lines. But it is possible to drill further into more specific subregions as well. We usually make our data sets publicly available. So when those are on our website, folks are welcome to crunch their own numbers and look at any specific analysis that they would like.
And incidentally, we have a website that you can get to by searching for Global Religious Futures, that has by country information about religious demographics and also restrictions. So if you're interested in any particular country in the world, you can go to that website and see in one place the different kinds of information that Samirah and I have talked about for that particular country.
Yeah, thank you, that's really helpful. So one more question. It says, in what ways do Pew's social hostilities indicators map onto hate crimes versus incidents?
That's a good question. So hate crimes are a type that target religious groups are a type of social hostility involving religion. So they do get included in our social hostilities indicators, and they might fall into different types of social hostilities according to our measures. So sometimes there might be mob violence. That's a specific measure we look at. We also look at just individual cases of harassment where just, one person faces harassment. And we also look at tensions between religious groups as well. Another type of social hostility we look at is when groups try to enforce their religious norms on society or on other individuals. So when the actor has a religious motivation, that also gets included in some of our indicators. But yes, incidents that are listed in hate crimes reports, if they involve religious groups, they tend to get included in our indicators.
Thank you. And following up on hate crimes and incidents, the next question asks, hate crimes and incidents against religious minorities have risen in Western countries over the past few years. Do you anticipate this continuing in the future in Western countries and elsewhere in the world?
So we do see fluctuations overall when we look at social hostilities, but when we look at the specific indicator that might encompass some hate crimes that target individuals, there are specific regions and specific countries that report increases, but it's difficult to predict, I think, for us, whether those trends will continue to increase.
Thank you. And I believe this might be our last question looking at the queue, unless anyone has any last minute ones. This one's a little longer. It says, can you share your thoughts on, quote, data for the non-data people? It says, oftentimes it can be a little daunting to look at data and statistics, or not everyone is comfortable communicating data. Can you share your thoughts about ways for research lay people, for lack of a better term, can interact with and explore data and research to inform their work?
Conrad, would you like to take that? I can try to start.
Sure, go ahead.
So I know for our presentations today, we threw a lot of charts and numbers, but in our reports and on our website, we actually try very hard to make our data understandable to a general audience. We go through, multiple editorial reviews to ensure that the language isn't too complicated. Some of the advice that I receive is, if you throw in too many numbers, it can get overwhelming for people. So you have to, give context, and it's often better to talk about general trends, broader trends than, all the specific data points that we have in our data sets. I don't know if that's helpful. Conrad, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I'll say that a joy about working at Pew Research Center is that we're really unique in having social scientists trained at the best universities around the world and journalists who've had experience writing for the world's leading publications working side by side together. And we help each other with our potential blind spots. Academics often only know how to write to one another, and journalists aren't trained in rigorous social science. And so our hope is that with this unique mixture of talent that we have, we put out reports that are accessible to the interested public who don't have necessarily any advanced training in statistics. And we try to only highlight results from our data that are statistically significant so that the reader can be confident that if we're calling something out, it's a significant pattern. And we're happy that many people do rely on our reports to talk about whatever the topic is that they're interested in. Of course, we work in religion, but our colleagues do polling on many other topics too. So probably it's beyond the time frame we have here to talk about any more general advice for how to do this. But I hope that our own reports will be a useful resource for anybody interested in our topics, to borrow charts, to see the key findings on any given topic that we've covered.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I know just from my own experience at Tanenbaum and sort of working in this religious D&I space that often this work is very qualitative. So that's why we love having you all and people from Pew and sort of featuring your work in every way that we can to really get that quantitative analysis, because we find it to be so valuable. And it looks like I lied about having no more questions. We had another one come through and we still have time, so this is great. It reads, do you have research or measures that track the diverse groups constituting the growing global white supremacist movement?
So we do have some recent reports where we've seen trends pointing towards an increase in activity by far-right groups and neo-Nazi groups that target religious and ethnic minorities. So a couple of years ago, we published a report that focused on a rise in such groups in Europe. And we saw that going hand in hand with what Conrad mentioned earlier, with the influx of refugees coming into Europe. So we do have some data that expands on that particular issue. And we continue to track activities by such group if they target religious groups.
Thank you. And now for real, I think that was perhaps our last question, and we're coming to the end of the hour. So that I think that works out well. And before we close things up and I start doing some housekeeping, I just want to thank Conrad and Samirah one more time for making time to be here today, for presenting this information and just kind of opening the space for us all to ask these really insightful questions. So just thank you so much. And with that in mind, in terms of some of the more housekeeping related matters, we'll be circulating in the chat in just a moment the survey for this presentation. So we ask that you complete that. It's great for us to have that on the back end as we close out the summit, but also to keep in mind as we move forward in the year and think about some more programming that's a little bit further out. And as you already may know, we're going to open things up on Thursday one more time, again at 12 p.m. Eastern time for another breakout session, really just to present the opportunity to connect with one another in a more intimate way and kind of delve a little bit deeper into this information. And then, of course, next week is the last week. It's the 5th installation of our 2021 summit. We're going to be closing things out with our CEO, Mark Fowler. He'll be conducting a learning lab, and that will take place on June 3rd, which is a Thursday. So just make a note there that it's not going to be on the Tuesdays like these previous iterations. There's still time to sign up, still time to share. So we hope to see you there. But with that, just thank you so much again to our friends at Pew and for all of you for joining us today.